Okay, and while Will is making his way up here, Will is local and he's come to a bunch of great legal marketing events and talked to our team, and every time he speaks, we learn. Sir, I'm going to get out of your way.
All right. Morning, everyone. Really excited to be here and kind of kick things off. We're going to talk about a lot of different things, but really focused specifically on recent case studies that we've been running regarding AI visibility. Before we even jump into that, just quick show of hands, like how many people have that on their radar whatsoever, right? I'm sure like everybody's heard of it, but how many people would say they're like really making an effort to find that AI search visibility? So a couple people. We're going to go through a lot of the findings that we've done and also give you guys some information as far as whether or not it's even the right place to focus your resources on, or even SEO in general. So before we jump into that, I'll tell you guys a little bit about my background. My background's a little bit different than a lot of people that you may speak with at different agencies. So I've been with BluShark for about 7 years now. I started out as an intern when I was in college. I then moved into a full-time position in our off-page SEO team, which is really more focused around the SEO components off of your website, link building, your Google business profile, stuff like that. I then stepped into a role a couple years later as one of our senior strategists, where I was that primary day-to-day point of contact for the firms that we work with, making sure that the strategy continues to evolve as our goals change, as the landscape of search changes. And because of what I was able to help our clients with in that role, I found myself in my current position, which is our senior account executive, helping to create these strategies out of the gate. A lot of the information that we'll run through, it comes from people smarter than me, people in our teams that are really living in the weeds here on a day-to-day basis. But I do think that the perspective that I'm able to bring to the conversation, just seeing things the way that they work, understanding a little bit more than just the overall strategy, is hopefully something that is going to be helpful. First thing that I want to kind of hit on here is whether or not SEO is the right thing for you. One thing that I have noticed just throughout the years is that a lot of people feel like they need to be doing something here because it's a buzzword, right? You hear quite a bit about just SEO in general. It kind of can mean sometimes a lot of different things, yet nothing simultaneously. And what I have found is that it is a very difficult thing to be successful in if it is not a core part of the strategy, or more importantly, something that aligns with your goals as a whole. I'll actually tell you guys a quick story here, because this is something that's happening very, very recently with us, and an example of who isn't the right fit to do SEO. So recently, we started working with a client about 5 or 6 months ago. They came to us. They said they've been a bunch of different agencies, right? Haven't seen great results. They were really heavy in the paid ads piece. So what we looked to do was build them a strategy where we could diversify ourselves away from that, right? We knew that we had to be real aggressive short term to see results on the paid ads piece. And that was going to be the most important thing for us to then continue to get results. Fast forward 4 months, we actually went above and beyond the aggressive goals that were set. We helped bring in $900,000 revenue for a criminal firm in Florida who was spending very aggressively on paid ads. And then they decided at that point that they wanted to stop doing everything and put together a class action lawsuit against Google. So they're stopping. So that is not, a firm that really should have been doing SEO, and that's, probably an example of how to not, invest in SEO, right? It's something where it wasn't aligned with their long-term goals. And that's step one. The other thing that I want to lead off with here is that if you don't have your basics, the fundamentals, like very much organized, ironed out, you aren't going to be visible on AI search, right? The AI search piece is something that is very difficult, if not impossible, to do based on the case studies that we're finding if you don't have just best practices in general incorporated across the board. If you are in a position where you're not even close to having visibility through local results, through traditional SEO, like the organic results, you are almost certainly not going to achieve AI visibility of significance, right? It's not one rule or the other, but it's something that's really important to note as we get into these case studies. And what we're seeing most recently is that there is just a real significant influence with the local results and how they influence LLM. One thing that we're seeing is that all of the major platforms are using local results as one of their sources for visibility. So right here you can see a lot of the most common and most commonly used AI search engines, right? Gemini, ChatGPT, Claude, and Perplexity. Now, our testing historically has been and continues to be very heavily focused on Gemini and ChatGPT. Now, we do see the most volume coming in through these engines specifically, but simultaneously, it is also where the tools are well enough developed for us to actually measure results, right? However, we're seeing quite a bit of overlap. Now, Gemini is very self-explanatory, and it makes a ton of sense that there's going to be a lot of correlation because it is with Google's algorithm, of course, right? It is a Google product. How many of you guys would say, though, that you use ChatGPT, Claude, or Perplexity more? I know Claude is a big one that a lot of people are trying these days. How many people for Claude? It's like your go-to. How many people would use a Claude search before you would use a Google search, or you would just remove a Google search entirely from that? So a couple people. And that's something that it does exist, although what we have found is that oftentimes there's going to be an element of both. When it comes to the attribution, the tracking piece, that is a very difficult piece. Something that I think is extremely important these days is to have additional checks in intake, right, to try and understand the source in which people are coming through. We're seeing many examples of people that are finding the firm through an AI search, but are then taking it to Google for whatever reason, and that's where the conversion's coming through. We're also seeing that it is at times almost redirecting to some of these Google profiles specifically. Now, Gemini, of course, Google, and like I said, the rest of these are using Google results in how they're providing information as well, either directly sorting Google or going about it in a weird way using third-party data aggregators. SERP API and Common Crawl are the two big ones where they're citing these things, which are then citing Google themselves as their primary source of information. And we'll talk a little bit about all of them. The thing that I think is very important to lead off with out of the gate as well is that if this is something that you really want to make a significant part of your strategy, it does require some extra resources on top of what you may invest for traditional SEO. Now, everything that we'll talk through, right, it is extremely situational. There's not one answer here that applies to everybody in the room. A lot of it has to do with the competition that you're facing, right, the saturation of your market, and I guess your total reach in general. Before you even look at investing into these things, you need to understand that. I would say that 90% of the conversations that I have with a firm, when we ask them going into it who they view as their top competitors in the market, like I said, 9 times out of 10, that is different from the firms that they're competing with truly from a digital standpoint. The big players, the heavy hitters in your market, those are not typically going to be the exact firms that are ranking. It's the people that are doing a great job of taking the authority that they've built and what they're doing in the real world and translating it to digital. Hunter, I think, mentioned something in the beginning of how he's trying to make an effort to take these things that are happening in the real world in the community and translating them. And that's what a lot of this boils down to. I'm sure everybody here is familiar with that idea of a Google business profile in that local pack. Like I said, this is the first place to start. The first thing that we're seeing, and we'll continue to work through the information here, is that if you are ranking in that local pack, you have a very high likelihood of being visible in the AI results. It's not the sexy answer to say, right? But we see that translate very effectively. And your Google business profile, obviously something we're all familiar with here, but most importantly, what I find is that the way that we can really be scrappy with our visibility is by pushing for reviews. Quick show of hands, like who feels they have a good process in place for reviews? Typically, I say if you've got more than 150, 200 reviews, you have a strong process. I will say not as many hands as I would have thought. The ones who aren't doing that, any reason in particular that there isn't a process in place? Is it something that you Is there a show of hands back there?
I was gonna say, like, the intake process, the outgoing process of the client is just how to effectively communicate to them, like, the appropriate way to say, hey, we appreciate you for your time, and encourage you to leave a good review if you had a satisfactory experience. I think a lot of times there's been hesitation to do that because, one, just the ask of it, but also two, just the kind of what if, how they're feeling, and there's got to be a push one or another just to ensure that reviews are going through, because it does help with search results, but also too, it's we have 2 locations and there's concern that reviews going to the wrong spot. We kind of, in fact, one location is tied to injury, one's tied to criminal offense, so we've had a disproportionate amount of reviews going in one spot or the other.
Yeah, and it comes down to strategy there, right? The fact that you have those set up differently, I like. Did you have something, Jeremiah?
The problem we run into it, if I had a Google review for every person that told us they were going to leave a Google review, I'd have thousands.
Mm-hmm.
It's to follow through and actually, and you don't. I feel like you don't want to pound people to death, but if you don't follow up, they just don't do it. So that's the issue.
And so you guys don't have currently like a system in place for those follow-ups?
We have a system, but it's my system, and it's not a good system.
It's a loose system. I think that's a really important thing to say. We have found a high quantity of reviews will come through that second, third, fourth follow-up. I was at the dentist a couple months ago. Literally, I'm up here talking about the importance of reviews. They asked me to leave a review. I said, yep, absolutely. I forgot. I got back home. I got a text. I went through and did it, right? I would say that if you're providing helpful service in a positive experience, I wouldn't worry too much about that. It's being cognizant of who you're asking for a review from. There are many different platforms out there that have systems in place. A lot of CRMs these days themselves, or just case management systems, have that. I would encourage people to take a look at it, to try and test it out. And really the thing that we see most consistently to be above and beyond the most effective way, candidly, is incentivizing the team for reviews. Question?
We've developed a system at Glasgow Legal that's gotten us up to 535.
Yeah.
And the way we do it is, as soon as we have the client's case settled and they're happy and, I just got, you settled my case for 150, that's when they get the review link. While they're still actively a client, not when they're walking out of the office and they don't care about us anymore. We've sort of, for lack of a better word, subconsciously made them see, made the clients think that that's just part of the process leading up to the disbursement. So as soon as they're happy with, with their money, we send the first review link. Then the second one, they're like, hey, we'd like to schedule your disbursement. When can you come in? And hey, did you get that done for us? And we also have the staff ask that, not the lawyers handling the case. So if they are sort of slightly miffed, we simply remove that and they're still happy with the lawyer. And if there's ever the slightest possibility that the client wasn't happy with the work, they don't get one, because negative reviews, will eat up 100 good ones.
Yeah, I think that's a really important thing that you said specifically about asking for the review when they find out, right, what they're getting, not when the check's in their hands, because that has already mentally been spent, right? New Lamborghini or whatever we're spending on. So I make that ask at that point. Another thing that I'll say before we shift gears real quick is I'm telling people these days to be cautious about like a QR code on their front desk, or like, when you walk in, you have a QR code to scan to leave reviews. This is something that we have found is likely attributed if at very high volumes to flagging it as spam or not all these reviews going through. It's something that I always want people to be top of mind of. We don't want to race to get quantity at the expense where we're sacrificing long-term. And then I will also say we're seeing just as much importance in the cadence these days as we are the volume. So, if we have 100 reviews and we get them all in a month, but then the next 4 months we aren't getting anything, that lack of recent engagement is something that is suffering.
Do you have a suggestion as to what to use in place of the QR code to make it easy for them to get?
Yeah, I like to just send them the link themselves, right? Like at some point it is a balance of, we don't want to make the process so complicated that it isn't helping us, but we need to have some system in place.
Something we learned very early on is never give your clients your office Wi-Fi if they're doing it at your office, because Google sees that it's coming through your IP address at that point, and you lose a lot of reviews.
Yeah.
Because they notice it's the same as where your GMB is coming from. So we never give clients the office Wi-Fi for that reason when they're doing the review.
Yeah, and I agree with that, right? But also at the end of the day, if we are getting the quantity of reviews, right, and they're legitimate, it's someone who has had an experience, right, like with your firm, what we found is that is fine, right? Like typically that is just going to work. Don't be too scared to ask for reviews. Just keep in mind, right, that there are the right ways to do it, and then there are gray area ways to do it. Last piece is that it's very common. I'll talk to people who they say, hey, there's no way that this competitor of mine like has 1,000 reviews, right? Like they're fake, they're buying them. I will say you'd be surprised, right? What real effort can do, but it's over time. It's not a short-term game. It's a process that needs to be in place for a while. Part of the reason why these reviews are so important, when we look at the local pack, our tests have shown us that there's about 180 or so different things that can influence your visibility in the local pack. Now, we'll talk about this translating to the AI results, but it all starts by understanding the market that you're in, right? Not just how many firms you think are competing with or how many big players are in the space, but truly understanding from a digital standpoint who those competitors are. This is extremely important because we need to understand, right, what can we reasonably expect to reach in the local results. We see the majority of conversions coming through these days, overwhelmingly so in the local results specifically. As you've likely seen for yourself, that search engine results page is continuously pushing those organic results farther and farther down the page. Now, if you get very niche with your search term, those organic results are likely to appear much higher up, and a local pack may not come through, but we're seeing that is where the conversions are coming from. Another thing that I'll say, almost to just set expectations from an AI standpoint, we do not see a huge percentage of conversions coming in through the AI results these days. Oftentimes, if people experience a big drop in traffic, right? Maybe you've noticed that. Anybody notice that personally, like a huge drop in just traffic coming through? Yeah, a lot of the traffic that we've seen be the most impacted are what I would just consider like discovery-based traffic, right? Or informational-based traffic. It's folks who are looking to learn about, maybe there was a blog on your site, right? Or content that you've produced in the past that wasn't super conversion focused. It wasn't low in the funnel. Now, that's not necessarily the worst thing, right? If it's we want the traffic to come through and we want that visibility, but we really want to focus on the conversion as opposed to vanity metrics. Understanding how competitive your market is, that allows us to realize how far we can reasonably expect to reach. Now, if the goal is to expand the volume of cases either that are coming through so that you can handpick the quality or just volume in general, the way that we want to approach this is by collecting a cumulative larger audience through dominating these smaller pockets of visibility and almost building on top of each other. This is something that needs to be done and implemented before it's necessary, right? If you're at the point where you're like, hey, I need more leads now, right? A satellite office, I need these now, right? It's likely too late. This is something that I can't stress the importance of being proactive about. Even if you think things are going fantastic, you don't need it right now, put those steps in place to protect yourself. Anything that we can do to diversify ourselves away from being overly reliant on one single Google Business profile, the better. This is also where stacking them, we found, just really, really allows you to perform strong with your cost per case. You can see that every market on the map has one of these funky red dotted outlines, probably very different than however you would understand your market. Or like if I asked you to, hey, say, draw it on a map, right? I doubt anybody would draw it in that way. But it's important to know because it's how Google understands your particular market. That doesn't mean, however, that we're only restricted to visibility in our red dotted outline. Depending on how saturated your market is, right, we may be condensed to a smaller pocket within, but what we always like to look for are markets where we can expand outside of it. This is a number that we calculate called reach. This reach is our best estimate that tells us if we dominate the entirety of the market that we're in, how many smaller surrounding suburbs in markets could we break into when Google doesn't feel that there is three quality firms in these small surrounding markets, they'll pull from one that's inside, right? So your reach can be larger than just purely the population of your city, especially in these less saturated spaces where there's not a ton of competitors. Right? While the city that you're in may not be super big, we have a high degree of likelihood of being able to break outside of it if you do these best practices in place. Just because of your wherever you're located does not mean that visibility is equal. It's kind of self-explanatory, but you'd be surprised, right? Both of these two firms, these are the geogrids for a search term for just personal injury lawyer. They're on the same block, right? But you can see very different results from a visibility standpoint. A lot of these small best practices. What we found, obviously, is that if you're not position 1, 2, or 3, you're not likely to convert, right? This is where the reviews come into play, and they're most important, however. Just because you're ranking number 1, those reviews are a huge conversion factor, right? And that's what we found. It's almost at the point where if you aren't someone who's capable of having a strong system in place to get us reviews, you're probably not the right fit to do SEO, at least very aggressively. And that quantity is relative to the firms that we're competing against. If we have 100 reviews, but we're ranking position 1, yet the firms position 2 and position 3 have 300 reviews each, our case studies have shown that we're not likely converting as well as we should be if we're position 1. So ranking itself is not everything as well. It's why I would really encourage everybody to keep pulse on the competition that you're facing and understand, set a goal from a review count standpoint. It's not just more, right? It's where do we need to be in order to convert. We found that it's at least 80% of the other firms in that 3-pack, but ideally we want to have 200% of what they do. That being said, there's a idea of diminishing returns, and that's something we'll talk about with additional satellite offices. This is a little bit of an example. This is a strong example of how growth can look in a low saturation to like mid saturation market. Now, this is not ever an expectation that I would set. I would never say 5 months in, right, we know that we're going to be dominating a market. But best practices can really make a difference here. You'll see, month 1 before doing any optimization, month 3, and then month 5. It's not a like snap of the fingers thing. There are, plenty of examples that we see of where small changes can have a real difference. But in this example specifically, just to put a weight to this visibility, this specific example, we saw 50 additional first-time callers with an average session duration over 30 seconds coming from this visibility. But it's very case by case, right? This is personal injury. And like I said, a mid-sized market, hard to weigh. But in order to understand what that visibility is worth, right, we need to be there. This is an example of a 2 months change, right? Another really strong example, but can show the impact. And this is a case study that we have, right? 50 plus callers. Maybe this was the stat that I gave. 50 plus first-time callers that we measured with an average session duration over 30 seconds to help get an idea of this. But you can see my favorite part about this example is the fringe visibility component. And I would consider fringe visibility as anything where we're ranking like position 4, 5, or 6. I believe very firmly, and we see time and time again, that it's not one thing that moves the needle across the board. It's a game of gaining 1 inch 12 different ways so that we can gain a foot. There's not a magic solution here.
Well, what is at the bottom? You have the 50 plus quality calls. Is that the increase that this firm saw in the 2 months by the boost and what's on the right?
Yeah, so this is a month difference. So like over the span of a month, that's what we were able to bring in here. Now, intake is something that needs to be strong.
You think because of the boost in the geo rankings on the right?
Yeah. Now, there's, of course, many factors that could influence this. Something that I always urge people to really have a good pulse on is, things and calls that come in through Google, they can come from a variety of different ways, things that you're doing in the community. Does not mean that this is purely associated with that increased visibility. Was there, question?
Do you know when this case study happened? Like what time frame?
I believe that this is from December of 2025. Okay. Yeah.
Because it seems like beginning of the year, the search results changed so much in Google the way they were presented.
They're going to continue to change. They're going to change every 3 months, right? And I also think it's important to stress that just because things are working now doesn't mean that they're going to be the best practices 3 months from now, especially with AI into the fold. I will say that to me is the biggest advantage to working with an agency is the ability to have someone who's staying on top of these things. But I also believe very firmly that you don't need to work with an agency by any means in order to be successful with your digital. Optimization of the Google Business Profile, there's fine tweaks that you can make through case studies and A/B testing that might be a little bit more difficult to do. There's the advantage of being able to allow your agency to learn from just things they're seeing across the board in general. But the Google Business Profile, the optimization, I would say specifically, if you're starting from a point of not having done anything, 75% of what can be done is very easy to do yourselves. It's just a matter of knowing what to look for. And I would say before starting up with an agency, you should give it a shot if you have the time to do it. Understand what coverage you can obtain without paying thousands of dollars for an agency, right? Especially in a non-competitive market. 2 resources that I would encourage people to write down, Search Engine Land and Search Engine Journal. If you go any given day, there's anywhere from 5 to 10 new articles that are published every day. It's a place that I go in reference time to time. It's a great resource to have if these are things that you're interested in really implementing and improving yourself, which, like I said, I feel very strongly there's way more that can be done than people realize, or maybe sometimes that agencies will tell you. You can do a lot of these things on your own if you just put the time into it. Shifting gears to the LLM results. Now, the world of AI, right, as you all know, if you use it yourself, changes very, very rapidly, right? Like, if we look back to where we were at a year ago today, it is entirely different. Capabilities are entirely different, right? And the volume of share, or the share of volume, search volume, is incredibly different. Part of the biggest issue that we find that just makes this more difficult is the tracking attribution piece. What you'll see is that in a lot of these examples that we're seeing, right, chat is almost presenting their own version of Google's local pack, right? They're also using Google as one of their primary, if not their primary source of information here. So intuitively, right, there is a lot of overlap, and that's what we've seen. That being said, the differences as far as who's searching, just like with a Google search, can be very different. We saw a study, and we referenced this study that, or validated this study that showed us, or told us that if 3 people all ran the same search, right, from their different desktops or mobile devices or whatever you want to call it, only 9% of them overlapped the exact same way as far as the 3 firms that were listed in the order in which they were listed. The conversion piece through that first placement, obviously much stronger than the second and third one. I think it was close to like 60% was coming in through that position 1. Now, when you see it, right, you can see an example here of what you might expect if you run a search. And I believe this is just for, best personal injury lawyers in Toledo, right? Looks very similar to the local pack. That being said, what you'll see is that it does not give you necessarily that place to convert. If you hit any of these buttons, what it will do is it will take you to almost like that Google Business Profile, right, where they're taking that information. Now, depending on the way you have your tracking set up, there's a high likelihood that it's just going to pull any tracking number you have associated with your Google Business Profile. That makes tracking messy, which is why it's really important to ask and understand, right, where are your searchers actually coming from. Like I said, very low volume that we're seeing now in these AI results, but we expect that trend to continue. And based on the amount of longevity that we do have, right, we feel that there's at least some stability that we're able to predict where things will continue to change, right? Ultimately, it's best practices in place, and a lot of these same things that, like I said, need to be done in order to be visible in SEO. Another example of Claude, right, in Claude's AI that's pulling from the local pack, right, and their own proprietary results. Claude is one of the search platforms or engines where the tracking piece isn't quite caught up, which is why I tell people to focus on chat and on Gemini, because we know that there's better tracking to actually measure results. But we can kind of look at the traditional cycle of search and trends that we see to hopefully help predict. Same thing with Perplexity, right? They all look a little bit different, but they pull information from your Google Business Profile, which is one of the next things that we are going to be talking about, because we're seeing more and more AI implementation in that Google Business Profile. easiest, lowest hanging fruit win that you guys can all do here is just make sure that you're doing everything that you're capable of doing on your Google Business Profile. Not only is this important just to help, tell them your audience, but what we're seeing is that the majority of these fields, if you aren't going in and adding information, they're making assumptions, right? That's the last thing we want. We don't want them assuming anything about us, rather telling them this information. Great place to start is just the Q&A component within that Google Business Profile. Another basic thing, right, it makes sense, but is one of the elements that I see in my conversations most commonly ignored, right, or when I'm kind of auditing these profiles is more commonly ignored. You all know what questions, right, are going to be the ones that are frequently asked. Provide it that information and look strategically into different things like search volume to get an idea of like how can I provide the information that people are looking for. Another piece is I always encourage people to consider changing their hours to 24/7 if you have after hours intake. We see that the searches that are run right after hours, Google wants to prioritize or they place added value to the firms that are open. They don't want to send a user to a firm that's closed. If you have after hours intake, I would consider doing that if you're confident in it, or at least test it out to see if it makes sense. But provide this information, control the narrative. Another section that I see very commonly is ignored or not optimized that I view personally as the most important is the areas served section in the Google Business Profile. How many people know about this section? How many people have filled it out themselves as opposed to what Google Auto provides? That's very important. I would say that one of the most common misconceptions that I see is people who are targeting like the biggest areas that they can, right? Let's say we're here, right? If we put Richmond in our areas served, right? Well, that might be true. I would consider that an inefficient use of these areas. We want to use these areas to target where they can carry the most weight for us. And what we found is that it's done by targeting those small pockets where we have fringe visibility, but there's not a high saturation of firms. That extra little bit of evidence that suggests that we're able to help. I would encourage people, if you have the time, to play around with A/B testing of these things. Make a couple changes, right, for areas that you think might be more effective, right? Just a couple of them, like no more than 5 at a time to really help get some A/B testing in place. Wait a week and pull geogrids. I believe we have geogrids for everybody who's here that I can email over to you to reference. I'll try and get them out to everybody just to have them. Yeah?
You mentioned pull geogrids outside of the third-party agency. How do we do that on our own?
Yeah, there's a lot of different tools that you can use out there. We use one called Local Viking, but there are plenty of them out there. I don't believe they're like incredibly costly. I can get with our team. I'm sure that there are ways that we can do it, and I wouldn't be surprised if that's something that a Claude honestly is able to help with, if not now, like a couple months from now. They're going to be pretty consistent across the board, but it's important to understand. And depending on where you're at right now, I always tell people to look at the firm that's doing best in your market as a starting place for just like what visibility can we, possibly expect, right? That we have proof of concept. We know this can be done. Any other questions about that Google Business Profile? This is, to me, guys, is the most important thing that you can do. It's not a sexy way, right? It's not like, the most complex, complicated thing, but it is the most fundamental thing that can influence your results for what we find.
Beneficial posting videos and pictures section?
Yeah, that's a really good question. If I always urge people, if Google lets you do it, do it. That being said, we saw a couple years ago that a frequency of like once per week was extremely important. Candidly, we've continued to test this and we have not found that, at least the test that we've run, it's influential, but it's a conversion piece. Firms that I speak with, even if SEO isn't something that you really are interested in, if your best clients aren't going to come in through Google, you need to understand that it is still a first impression, right? Like a profile that's very well built out. If somebody just runs a search for your firm in Google, you don't care about SEO, right? I see time and time again, it's a firm that has 5 reviews, they're all 1 star, right? And the profile shows like some random picture that's in front of their office. Not a strong first impression, right? Even if you're getting a lot of your cases, things like that through referral, it's really important to test this out. Another thing that is important to do is just continuously revisit this Google Business Profile. I've seen horror stories of, I'll give you guys a specific example, a firm actually located up in Maryland that we work with. I'm trying to remember the name of where they're at. Doesn't matter, but the firm itself, when they called, they reached out to us. They were like, we don't know what happened. Our leads fell off a cliff, right? Like all of a sudden it was overnight. And what we found, this is terrible, and I would never say that expect this to happen, but keep an eye out for it. A competitor had taken their PIN, their address, dragged it 20 miles up into the middle of the forest. If you don't decline these things, right, or keep an eye on it, I think it's a 72-hour window that you have to tell them that it's wrong. There's oftentimes Google will push it through. They think it's right. It's like the user information that's being added there. That was not user information, right? Like that was somebody who was I don't know, had a grudge with this firm. But just keep an eye out for it. I tell people just check it twice a week, or at least know right where the emails are going to be coming into that are indicative of when Google tells you like, hey, a change has been made. I've seen people change hours. I've seen a lot of different things here, and you want to expect the best from people, but you don't always get it, right? And just keep an eye, protect yourself, but also being careful with that Google Business Profile name. That's a big one that I see very commonly. Don't keyword stuff, right? Get it through DBA. We'll shift gears here, but if anybody wants, we just put out a book on just local search in general. A lot of these things that we talked through are in there. I'll give everybody a couple seconds in case you want to scan it. We'll send you a copy. Like I said, I feel very strongly that a lot of these things are things that you don't necessarily need an agency to do, right? Especially the best practices. There's a lot more that can be done. And I might even go as far as to say, do these things before trying to assess whether or not an agency is something that you actually need. Give one more second. Looks like we're good. So with ChatGPT, what we're going to look at are the case study results that we found on that 15% of best practices that aren't overlapping with traditional SEO best practices. Like I said, 85% of these things, they're going to be the same as just your typical Google best practices and fundamentals for visibility. That extra 15% is going to be different. But if you don't have that 85%, doing the 15% for AI visibility is not going to matter. What we've found is that the biggest differences, and there's a slide towards the end of this that's going to compare it. Google specifically, we found the best impact comes from the way that we produce information, our content. And with ChatGPT, we're finding that it is a lot more aligned with your off-page SEO best practices. I'm sure that most of you have heard the term link building, right, or referring domains. Show of hands, I hope, most people. Still very important, that signal is very important, but as these search engines are getting more and more advanced, right, we're seeing that they're able to pick up and just understand the brand mention in general, right? Even if we don't have a link, they're able to understand how many times, like the frequency in which you're being mentioned here. Schema markup is another big one. Tiffany in the back knows way more about schema markup than I do. That's where our dev team really helps me out. But essentially, telling the bots, correct me if I'm wrong, Tiffany, telling the bots, exactly what the major takeaways from a particular page are, more or less. Yeah, that's a huge one. Review schema, right? Like incorporating things into the page that allow them to very easily understand, like biggest takeaway here are these things. Another show of hands, like how many people are concerned about a big firm coming into their market, just like outspending them or anything along those lines? Not that many people. I think that's incredible because I view it as not necessarily like the worst thing in the world, right, if we play to the strengths that we have. One of the common, I guess, opportunities to differentiate yourself, right, beyond that first experience is the way in which we're building the schema markup to highlight our wins. One thing in particular, right, if you have a Morgan & Morgan coming into your market or a big firm, are we likely to win on just total number of dollars recovered, right? that might not be the battle that we want to fight. We might want to talk about our reviews that really talk about our long-standing impact in the community, all of these things that can play to our strengths, as well as not being afraid to, almost lean the other way. We're not a huge firm. If you're not a huge firm, right? Like it's a community, personalized feel, right? It leverage these things that allow you to be different. Awards and recognitions. If I had another piece of homework for everybody, and what we found to be really effective that you guys can implement yourself, is identifying at least one opportunity to nominate yourself for a best lawyer in whatever city award. There's going to be citywide ones, there's going to be statewide ones, right, where you submit yourself to win best law firm amongst a whole list of other, best pizza shop, whatever the case may be, and then you usually vote to try and win these things. It's something that you can really take control of, right? Encourage your friends, family, everybody to vote, get that visibility, and then having you on a list that says, best law firm in Fairfax, right? Like that's a great win, and we found them to be effective. Questions?
Testimonials question. You have Yelp up there.
Yeah.
How much does it matter to diversify across the platforms? Because like somebody was mentioning, it's kind of hard to actually get those reviews, and we've been heavily focused on Google reviews.
Yeah. It gets to a point where it's kind of picking at straws, right? Like I agree. It's especially if you don't have a quantity that is comparable to the firms in your market, Google is where we find them to be most effectively held, right? But if you have extra, right? God forbid we have a bunch of reviews that we don't need them on our Google Business Profile, right? You can look at Yelp, or really just to say that the Yelp reviews that you do have, they do carry weight. I think that the review piece is one where, yes, we need a process in place, but if you are providing quality service over time, right, you're going to see a lot of these things happen somewhat organically.
How often are these AI systems changing the metrics that they use in their searches? I ask because one of the things I do is I analyze our own site, and I ran a chat search on us using AI, our firm, just a couple of days ago, and it used Google. I just did it now from Perplexity, and it's only giving me the best firms by Yelp reviews.
Yeah.
So how is the system, the same AI system has changed its search metrics in 72 hours? So how often are they doing this?
You're telling me, yeah, a ton, right? Like honestly, there's a lot of evolutions, right? Not just like where they're pulling from, but their algorithms in general, right? Like Google's algorithm changes, therefore, anywhere that's citing it changes. If you focus on these best practices, what we found is that despite all the changes, right, you're gonna usually come out on top, and do the right things, right? If you are giving that good experience, right, reviews come to Google. That's what we found to be the most effective, like I said. But keep an eye on the way things are changing. Just don't be overreactive as well. If you look at the trends, we see time and time again, even just going back years and years and years with Google, a lot of times they will make a significant adjustment, right? They'll almost overdo it, and then they'll course correct and they'll kind of turn things back a little bit to the actual reasonable amount. One example of this that caught a lot of people's attention was they went through a little over a year and a half ago, they took away tons and tons of reviews. It was last January, February. Overnight, seemed like every firm in the country had a huge quantity of reviews that were removed. And then the majority of them came back, right? And the ones that we at least are able to see to the best of our ability that were, that stayed down were probably gray-ish area reviews. Places where you're at a conference. I no longer encourage people to be like, hey guys, if you like this presentation, everybody go leave me a review right now, right? Things that, may lend themselves towards a spammy practice, whether it's being done intentionally or not. The lawyer profiles and citation sites, this one kind of pains me to say it because we haven't always seen them to be a strong use of resources, and they can be costly. In times, they're effective. A great way to even start and try and get an idea of whether or not these are effective for you is if you ran a search for a car accident lawyer, right, in your market, if Avo's showing up very high towards the top, right, the first or second result, might be worth considering if you have extra budget and just getting an idea of whether or not that's working. But these authoritative placements.
That internet brand bought them all now. So Martindale rolled out a package that has lawyers.com, NOLOs, lawyers, fine law. You basically get them all for for a price for one attorney or for a number.
Yeah.
What's the name of that?
Martindale.
No, but internet.
Internet
brands.
brands.
Yeah, I think, yeah, you're right to your point. And even if it's not these big ones, right, just fill out the directories. What we have found is that before you need to go in and buy them, right, a lot of these things can be done without the paid versions. But if you have extra funds to look at, right, this is one option. It's just super case-by-case specific. And then press releases, right, like digital PR. The content, which we'll talk about as well, is just shifting more and more towards helpful information, right? It's the easiest way to describe it, but the way that it's technically described is EEAT, which is experience, expertise, authoritativeness, and trust. Content-wise, the trends that we found most successful are the ones that really focus on quality of depth of information, not a huge broad coverage of information. If you guys look through your pages in analytics or wherever you track your data, and you see that there's a page that is not really visible, it's not bringing in any traffic, it hasn't been for years and years, right, or a very significant period of time, that might be an indication to take it and help use the information to build out a separate page within your site, right? Like these are things that you can play around with, but if it's not broke, don't fix it, right? Don't make any changes to pages that are performing well. Just keep an eye on the data and how it performs. Couple examples, right, to kind of show you these things. Here's an example in chat for Coachella Valley injury. You can see that with the schema markup, right, Google or chat rather is specifically citing strong track record of multi-million-dollar recoveries for clients in serious injuries and wrongful death cases, right? Like they're pulling this from the schema, and then you can see well, you probably can't see because it's tiny, but they're referencing the site as that source of information. Like I said, typically we are seeing at least 3 options are being provided here. It's not always going to be the same. Don't worry a ton about if it fluctuates based on if you're running a search here versus if you're running a search there. If you're in this fight, right, and you're doing these things, we have time on our side. And it's just another example of them referencing the site in general. Another example here where you can see they're really looking at just what's in the Google Business Profile, the reviews, but also the content in reviews, right? That's another small thing that we've seen a lot of success with. I think it's a strong recommendation to have some sort of guided, not a template, that's a bad word to use, but guidelines maybe for somebody who's leaving a review. And I like to start with where are you located at, right? Like what type of case did I help you with, and like what's one thing in general that you enjoyed about working with our firm, right? Whether it's being friendly, it's the expertise, it's whatever the case may be. Get some information on these reviews. Usually 2 to 3 sentences is gonna do great, because we do see that oftentimes like these bulleted informations will be citing directly the content that's in your reviews.
Are you pulling that from the? Can you explain what you mean? You said you get those data more time.
Yeah, so this is provided directly from chat. It's provided directly from chat. And it's a recommendation. You can, like I said, probably can't see, but up top it says a strong recommendation for a well-regarded personal injury firm in Plainfield, New Jersey, right? And it's providing the firm, right? Similar look and feel to the Google Business Profile, and then it lists information about why the bullet points stand out. Something that is always helpful to do for your own research is when you run that search, if you see that it's not you who's ranking, right? Ask it why. Go back and forth with it. Just ask it information. And you can sometimes get an idea, right, of where it's really coming from. But keep in mind, they want to give you reasons and things, right? So take them with a grain of salt, but it's good to know, especially if it's an overlap with one of the best practices.
What does it mean on the bottom, no link, phone number, call to action?
Yeah, we're seeing this kind of go back and forth a little bit, where there isn't really a call to action on chat. And what we've found is that it then means people are going to go into Google, run a search. Messy attribution, right, which is why we want to ask time and time again, because really this is a lead that would be attributed to AI, right? It's going to come in through Google though. And it's even trickier because it's probably going to come in through a branded search in Google, which historically, we might point towards specifically as like unrelated entirely to SEO, right? Someone who's looking directly for you all. It's another reason to track data. And that's the biggest thing for me, is it's just we need to understand the competition, the data, to even know where to start from a recommendation standpoint.
when you're doing this pressure testing, right, with Google or ChatGPT or whatever, should you be like in incognito mode? Like, because like if it senses your IP address is at it's gonna be like, oh, hey, here's the number one search result. This guy's like 0.2 miles from you.
Yeah,
right?
it will. Use it in incognito. I to be honest with you, I don't know how perfect that even is. But try it on different desktops, different browsers, right, from different places. See what it shows. I do see, right, like they look at cache if you're not in an incognito browser. I've seen firms who run the same search that I'm running, and it's showing the 3 competitors that they thought, or think of as the most, their biggest competitors, and it's because they go to their sites all the time, right? Come to find out. So,
is there a preferred browser to do that type of like kind of pressure testing on the SEO with like DuckDuckGo or anything like that, or
test all of them. To be honest, this is something I was having a conversation literally yesterday or maybe the day before, and it was a firm out in Seattle, and they say it was their CMO. Fractional CMO, and I would, by the way, highly encourage people like a fractional CMO is a great place to start. It will help your agency perform a lot better. They saw better results. Honestly, this is the first time I heard this with Bing ads specifically, right? They're in Seattle, right? And I think the conclusion we came to is that it's likely because of the Microsoft tie up there, right? So try everything. My mindset is try it, test it, track it, right? I would say our data suggests that it's typically Chrome, right? But I don't know that there's a right or wrong answer. And the best practices, like I said, will usually overlap. I bet you most people, even if you haven't set this up yourself, probably have a Bing profile, which is Google's version of a Google Business Profile, where they're pulling information the best they can. But go through, check, make sure it's accurate. And the more things that we're doing, low-hanging fruit can't hurt. I want to go real quick to a couple of these major differences. Obviously, Gemini is really similar to Google's best practices. Now, like Google has come out and said that this is going to become more and more of a part of their best practices, or not of their best practices, of the way that they implement information into the search engine results page. Those AI overviews, right? You see them probably in your own searches. They are higher and higher up on the page. That doesn't mean it's where the conversions are coming from. But at the very least, right, we want that repeat visibility, right? And this is sometimes why the paid ads piece can also help from an SEO standpoint in general. They see your name, they see your name, they see your name, right? But focus on that local pack is my advice from a results standpoint. Still changing very rapidly. And the content piece, right? Experience, expertise, authoritativeness, and trust. I have a slide that kind of shows the fundamental differences between them. One of the biggest ways is the way that we produce information, the way that we write it. You can almost think of this as like, how would you want it to sound if you asked somebody a question and they explained it to you, right? Like we call it topic clusters, where you're producing like almost a question answer naturally, right? Like whatever the question may be, a couple sentences about it. We're also seeing that the AI engines, rather than pulling like the entirety of information from one page, they're pulling segmented information from a variety of different sources to help paint a story, right? So depth of information in something very particular, right, we find to work really well, especially with just the landscape of search more and more saturated every day. But headings matter, bullet points, numbered lists, we found these things to work. I would also encourage people to try and identify if there are any ways they can produce information through their expertise, specifically like being in an area for a long period of time. Right? Can we produce information that is valuable, that can be picked up by other sources? This is a big focus on digital PR a lot of the times, but there are a lot of different ways that you can approach that. Start by thinking where you have a competitive advantage. There's more case studies, stuff that we've seen here. I just want to get to one slide before we wrap up on the... And I'd encourage everybody, I have a link to scan this, to look through this presentation in your own time as well. To really like get an idea of these case studies. But this would be a picture I would recommend, or a slide I would recommend taking a picture of. You can see just like major best practices between both of these AI search engines. Like I said, just based on the case studies that we've run, I do think it's important to note that anybody who tells you that they have it perfectly figured out, right, they don't. And just because these things are what works now does not mean that that's going to be the same best practices that are working 6 months from now. Right? But we want to continuously try to look ahead. Although this is what we're seeing to work, The blue items specifically are where we're seeing major differences between both platforms. So you can see like Gemini, we're seeing that like really specifically content is helping quite a bit here. What I would also say is don't look for AI visibility for the sake of it, right? Start by figuring out what's the right AI visibility for you to have, right? Or what search terms do we want to have, and then reverse engineer your way backwards from there. Similar to traffic over the years, a ton of traffic is not indicative of like performing well through SEO necessarily.
I wonder if you're hearing of people saying that AI is pulling from old sources. What I've had happen to me recently is a lot more calls coming in from people saying they found me on AI, but for very, very old practice areas from old content that I thought was long gone.
Yeah.
I don't know if you're hearing that or
We
if
are hearing that. We are hearing that. Now, question would be, are they case types that you still want or cases that you still want? So I always try and tell people, advise people against removing the content entirely. You know, there is something to be said for these search engines seeing that someone is going through to your site, right, and they are receiving like helpful information for them. One thing that we found to work well is maybe removing the call to actions on that page specifically, right? Like so that there's not a form, you know, right in front of your face on the right-hand side if it's really something we don't want. That usually helps. It's not going to do everything, but it's a good thing if our information's showing, right? And we want to make sure that, you know, we are being seen as that source, but it is something that we hear quite a bit. And honestly, we were hearing this even before the AI piece was a major component. It is important to continuously refresh your content. Like even an old page, we found just going through, right, refreshing the content, right, like implementing some best practices that hadn't been there before if there's no visibility coming through. That stuff can make a big difference. And is really a best practice in general to continue to refresh that content. ChatGPT, like I said, it's a lot more off of your site that's really making a big difference here. Even things like Wikipedia, which are notoriously difficult to set up for yourselves. If you have a real valid excuse to do it, or at least make an effort at it. But Reddit, press releases, these sorts of things, we're seeing a lot of success in right now. Now, if you ask me about Reddit, that's something that people ask me about quite a bit. My guess is that 5 years from now, a year from now, this isn't going to be as important as we're seeing right now because it's very, very heavily just influenced by things that aren't real, right? Like you can very much go in and stuff visibility into Reddit, but it is very helpful right now, right? And it's important to do it the right way, I would say.
What kinds of things are you speaking about putting on Reddit?
It's a good question. I'll get with our off-page SEO team. I'll tell you one example specifically that we've used over the years that I think has stood the test of time. An AMA, an Ask Me Anything, right? Like setting up an Ask Me Anything where you're on Reddit for an hour and let's say you're, were you IP? Do I remember that correctly?
Internet defamation.
Internet defamation, okay. Well, you probably don't want to do an Ask Me Anything about my internet defamation, but I don't know if you're a criminal firm, right? Like a celebrity who's in the news for, I don't know, getting arrested, right? Something like that. Ask me anything about this. People come through, right? You engage with them back and forth. This is I would consider something that stood the test of time, a way to interact, get out there on Reddit, and you'd be shocked at sometimes how many people we have seen come into these AMAs. It's honestly shocking at times. I think that's probably what we have. This is just a scan to receive a copy of the presentation, as well as just making sure that if you want the geogrids, like you definitely want the geogrids. I'll run through the people who filled this out first and get them to you. Like I said, there's just a lot of power in having that knowledge in what we found. You do not need an agency a lot of the time, right? SEO may not even be the right thing for you. I think even just chatting about whether or not it is or isn't, or it's the right time or it's not, can help. But the case studies in there, right? Understanding the ways that we found, at least, that you can be visible. And then the last thing that I do want to add there is, we see trends with higher education and higher value, more research cases can lend themselves to AI. If you are working and looking for cases where you're more likely to have a lot of research going into a decision prior to making it, that might be a good indication that AI has some sort of value. But it's difficult. There's no one size fits all approach. So I think that's my time. I will hang around for a little bit though. If anybody has any questions specifically, I'll do my best to answer, based on your exact circumstances.
Thank you, Will.
Thanks, guys.